Hello, everyone. The South Carolina Office of Special Education Services, along with the Transition Alliance of South Carolina, present Using Evidence-Based Practices to Teach Self-Determination and Advocacy. This presentation is part of the Summer Transition Camp webinar series. The information and resources contained in this webinar are for general information purposes only and should not be construed as an endorsement by the South Carolina Department of Education.
Our presenter today is Dr. Margot Izzo. Dr. Izzo serves as Program Director, Special Education and Transition Services at Ohio State University. She completed her PhD in Special Education, Rehabilitation, and Research at OSU in 1998 and received her master's from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She is a recipient of the Mary E. Switzer Fellowship from the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, and is also a past president of the Division of Career Development and Transition within the Council for Exceptional Children. Her research interests include digital curricula in high schools, increasing reading achievement, IT literacy, and self-determination, defining and redefining employment goals on IEPs, effects of post-secondary programs, education, and employment to increase the employment outcome. Dr. Izzo will be presenting today on evidence-based practices for self-determination and advocacy.
Thank you, Jennifer and Mike. This is one of my favorite topics because self-determination and self-advocacy are skills we all use every day, whether we have a disability or not, whether we're in high school or middle school or in college or an adult. We use self-determination and self-advocacy skills if we want to achieve our goals. And so I've outlined 4 session objectives today. The first is just to describe self-determination and self-advocacy. And since these are not new topics, I'm going to do that fairly quickly. I am going to sprinkle research throughout the presentation and give you more resources for how to find more research on self-determination and self-advocacy. And then I'm going to share examples of the potential impact with transition youth. I think we all learn by sharing stories, and I'm going to be sharing some of my stories, and I encourage you to develop some of your stories that you can share with your colleagues and your future students. And then I'll be spending some time on providing evidence-based resources that you can use to empower all students, those with disabilities as well as those without disabilities, with the self-determination and self-advocacy skills that they will need to complete high school with a plan for either continuing their education in college or entering the employment arena. So self-determination is actually the umbrella term that is used to describe self-understanding and awareness, self-efficacy, or having the confidence that you can set a goal independently and accomplish that goal. Making choices about what goals you want to achieve and want to plan to achieve, problem-solving skills. Whenever you set a goal, you're going to run into some challenges, whether it's not enough time to master your goal or running into some type of obstacle. And we need to use our problem-solving skills on a daily basis. And problem solving is part of that self-determination process. Decision making, maybe when we run into a problem, we need to outline what are some potential solutions and what the positive and negative aspects of each decision that we make, or the pros and the cons of the decision. And then once we make a decision, advocating with our peers, with our teachers, with our coaches, with our families, with our friends to gain the support that we need to accomplish our goal. And then that whole process of goal setting and attainment and self-regulation. Oftentimes we don't set the right goal, and we have to go back and readjust the goals that we set. So as this list of the self-determination components reflects, self-determination is a multi-step process that begins with understanding our strengths, our abilities, our skills, our challenges, and what we want in a given day, and then regulating the goal setting process to accomplish those goals. There is a lot of research on self-determination and self-advocacy, and there is an article written in Remedial and Special Education entitled A Conceptual Framework of Self-Advocacy for Students with Disabilities. And this is a great resource for those of you who want to dig deeper into just what does self-advocacy mean. I really look at self-advocacy as a beginning step of awareness and disability acceptance. And there are a lot of strategies that a teacher, a family member, a psychologist, or a district representative can use to help students understand why they were identified for special ed services and why they have an IEP. For example, you can review the files with the student and share their strengths and their abilities and how they've learned over the previous years of school. We can help students gain a deep understanding of their disability. And I'll be talking a lot about the positive impact of using mentoring and role models to help students understand that a disability does not define them or limit their potential, and how it's becoming almost popular these days to disclose that you've had issues with depression or anxiety, and a number of actors and actresses and entrepreneurs and millionaires and CEOs are disclosing that they do have a disability. And what we want to always focus on, especially as students are reaching that middle and high school age, is we want to always emphasize the student's assets and use an asset-based approach when we talk about disability, not so much the deficit-based approach, but helping our students understand that all of our brains are wired differently, and it really makes for a richer community when we can bring the assets and the talents across the community together to solve some of the big issues that are facing not only each individual student, but also global issues like this COVID pandemic that we are all struggling with, and we all have a role to play, and it takes all of our collective engagement to really make progress in reducing the negative impact of the COVID pandemic. So here is a resource that I want to share with you. And this has been tried and true by transition specialists and transition coordinators and teachers for over a decade. The 411 Guide on Disability Disclosure is a workbook for youth with disabilities that was published by the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability. And it talks a lot about self-disclosure, both within an educational setting, as well as in an employment setting, and also within relationships. And it provides some role-playing practice for youth with disabilities directly. You can download this and print this out for free. And there are companion documents that are focused on what the educator needs to know to be able to use this workbook for youth with disabilities. And there's also parent resources that are available. So you can have the teacher, the student with the disability, and their family all using companion documents that talk about when to disclose and when not to disclose. I also want to share resources that are on the Ohio Employment First website. This is a document that was produced by a center in Ohio called OCALI, the Ohio Center for Autism and Low Incidence Disabilities. And they have produced evidence-based practices for transition youth that builds upon the information that is at the national, the NTACT website. And so David Tess and Catherine Fowler have reviewed this document. And what they've done is they've identified the evidence-based practices, and self-advocacy and self-determination is an evidence-based practice. And they then give the research behind the practice and the strategies and approaches that teachers have used to teach self-determination and self-advocacy. And then they have a companion document that is called Evidence-Based Predictors for Transition Youth. And these were designed for use by special educators, general educators, transition specialists, VR counselors, and DD specialists. And so the Ohio Employment First website, again, provides information on both the evidence-based practices and the evidence-based predictors that transition personnel, whether you're at the middle or high school or you're at an adult service agency, can use. And I don't want to spend a lot of time going through these documents because they are easy to find on the Ohio Employment First website. So why the emphasis on self-determination? Why does this topic continually be revisited in our transition conferences? And some of the research that I like to quote, even though it is getting a bit dated, but it's a stark example of the impact of having high self-determination. So back in the 90s, and maybe this is before many of you were even in the profession, so maybe this is new research for you, but Mike Waymeyer took individuals who scored higher on measures of self-determination, and he contrasted their outcomes with students that were in high school who had low measures of self-determination. And he found that having high self-determination scores on a self-determination assessment prepared students for more satisfying lives. In this research, the researchers identified 80 students with intellectual disabilities and learning disabilities in their final year of high school. And he followed up 1 year after they graduated to take a look at, were their employment outcomes the same if the individual student had high self-determination versus low self-determination. So he didn't divide these 80 students by disability and put all those with intellectual disabilities in one group and all those with learning disabilities in another group. He didn't divide them by whether they were in inclusive educational environments or separate educational environments, but he used just their score on a self-determination assessment. And he divided the two groups into those students with high self-determination and those students with low self-determination. And then he followed up 1 year after graduation and collected a lot of information and did chi-square analysis and looked at an analysis of variance by IQ score to see what the effects of having high self-determination were. And so the results of this research study found that those students with high self-determination, as represented by the gray bar, as compared to students with low self-determination, as represented by the blue bar, there were distinct differences. So let's take these 5 skills that typically adults after high school who are living independently are expected to do. When you take being able to pay your phone bill, 24% of the students with low self-determination were able to pay their own phone bill, where 32% of students with high self-determination were able to pay their own phone bill. That was not a significant difference, even though those with high self-determination levels were more likely to be paying their phone bill. But when you look at having a checking account or having a savings account, let's just jump to having a savings account. 72% of those students with high self-determination had a savings account, whereas only 38% of those students with low self-determination had a savings account. So that, for me, undermines the importance of graduating students who have high levels of self-determination and have the confidence to be able to manage a savings account or manage a checking account or manage grocery shopping. It doesn't necessarily mean that you do this totally independently, but it means that you know how to gain the supports you need, whether it's calling up your mom or dad and saying, you know, I think I'm overdrawn and I can't figure out why. Can you help me out here? When you look at working for pay, you see that students with high self-determination, those students with intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities with high self-determination were almost twice as likely to be working for pay. And that's why they had checking accounts and savings accounts, because they had a job. But when you look at whether or not having high self-determination means you can independently go get your own job, you'll see there was not a significant difference. And so finding a job is a complex activity that requires supports, even if you have high self-determination. And so what I take away from this is not only do students need to have high self-determination, but they also need to know where to get the supports to find your own job, because the job they obtain after leaving school will hopefully not be their career job for the rest of their life. And we expect all citizens to have many job transitions throughout their career, and knowing how to contact vocational rehabilitation services or DD, or knowing how to use your personal network to find employment are critical skills that people with high and low self-determination need to gain. So that's one of the studies, and there's many, many more studies that say and validate that having high self-determination results in better adult life outcomes and better success in going to college as well. Unfortunately, we know that not all students with disabilities gain the self-determination and advocacy skills they need to transition successfully. We know that students with disabilities lack disability awareness. if there's one thing that college disability counselors have told me repeatedly for the past 20 years is, please tell high school teachers to let students with disabilities understand what it means to have a learning disability, because not all learning disabilities are the same, or what it means to have an intellectual disability, or what it means to have a visual or a hearing disability, and why the accommodations that they're getting in high school are specially customized to kind of level the playing field for what the deficits of that disability has created. We also know that many students in high school lack information about how they learn. Students with disabilities often have low expectations by teachers, by family members, and eventually by themselves. They begin to make excuses and say, well, I don't have to learn that. I have a disability. And that is not true. Students with disabilities can learn pretty much the same information as anybody else, but it might take more support, more resources, and more self-determination by that individual to learn it. Also, having disability creates stigma and stress and trauma. And I'll share a little bit about what my daughter went through when she was identified. And all of that boils up to not having the self-determination, because we get caught up in that cycle of low expectations. And what happens to students who do not learn to accept their disability and set goals and apply self-determination and self-advocacy skills? Well, we know 40% of students with disabilities drop out of school, and 30% have been using drugs, and 33% have been arrested. And although these data are probably 10 years old at this point, I believe that they are still fairly true for the disability population that is graduating or dropping out of school each year. And we have a drug addiction issue in this country. And we know that our students, if they don't fit in and belong in a high school setting, often they will choose the wrong type of group to join. And that is a group that gets engaged in using drugs, and they get arrested. And it is an epidemic. And I want to share that there are a lot of resources at AnnetteFranks.com. This is a counselor in Central Ohio who was addicted herself, had siblings who were addicted, and has done the tough work to overcome her addiction, and has now dedicated her life to helping others overcome their addiction. And there are a lot of free resources on her website that you can use if you want to help a family or a student understand how to get out of this cycle of addiction. So the stigma of having a disability is so strong that, according to the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, 60% of students in college who had an IEP in high school, so we know they had a disability, denied having a disability in college, thereby giving up their right to accommodations like extended time on tests and assistive technology that is just for individuals with disabilities. We worked with a number of students in our National Science Foundation project. These were students with disabilities who were pursuing degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Very, very competitive and complex majors. And many of these students with disabilities were on their second college track and second college, where they had flunked out of their first college because they denied having a disability and therefore did not use accommodations that were there for them to use that leveled the playing field. And when we shared with these students how to advocate for what they needed, they became empowered to complete their college degree program and move on to STEM employment. So I want to share some teachable moments, and this is where I'm going to tell a little story. And it's a story that inspired a book that I wrote with Laderick Horn, who is one of my mentors, a young man with a learning disability who has been out on the speaking network, very passionate about helping youth themselves understand that a disability does not close doors. In fact, if you learn to manage your disability, it can actually open many doors. And so I have a daughter. She was identified as having ADHD in 4th grade, and she had learning challenges. She had difficulty reading and went to reading recovery, and yet she did not qualify for special ed services. The gap between her achievement and the achievement of her peers was not large enough. So even though we went through the whole multi-factored evaluation process, she was not eligible for special ed. So as Nicole aged, she went into middle school and she learned to use medication, but she hated being on medication. And then as she went into high school, her course of study became more challenging. And she was failing geometry. She had a D in Spanish, and she didn't have much better than a D in biology. And, these are rigorous courses. And finally, the guidance counselor said, she really needs an intervention specialist. We need to put her on an IEP because you, mom, cannot be negotiating all of her intervention supports. Well, when Nicole found out she was going to be identified as a student with a disability, her reaction was extreme. And she said if I put her in special ed, she was going to commit suicide. Well, when I shared that with the school, that made her eligible for more services. And thank heavens it did, because she was paired with a counseling service that the school provided, who finally connected with her and helped her identify with the frustration and the challenges that her ADHD caused. And this was, I remember Nicole saying, this is the first person who understands what it's like to be in my body. And, this was a counselor who was used to working with high school students with and without disabilities. And even though I had been dragging Nicole to counseling since middle school for a variety of oppositional behavior, which some could term as typical adolescent development, and yet I wasn't going to be ignored as her mom. And so she really benefited from having this school counselor who was very skilled in working with high school students. Meanwhile, knowing that ADHD has a genetic disposition, wanted to determine if I had ADHD. And even though I was successfully employed, I still struggled on my job, and I struggled in some of my schoolwork, and I struggled with time management. So I went ahead and became assessed and found out, yep, I have ADHD. And so then I was able to start taking medication, and Nicole and I could talk about the negative effects of taking Adderall because your mouth gets dry. And we could talk about what it's like to have poor time management and poor organizational skills. And I wanted her to realize that I struggle with many of the same things that she was struggling with in high school. And yet she was, again, in that adolescent, yeah, sure, mom, sure, mom. Well, gaining self-determination and self-advocacy is a process. And finally, she went to college, and of course, she wasn't managing her medication. She ran out of medication, and I had to drive 3 hours to the college that she was at and bring her medication. And I was trying to discreetly slip it on her desk and call her attention to it. And she was like, "Oh, mom, all my friends know I have ADHD. It's okay." And she had disclosed to her friends on the basketball team that she was on. And so that was very helpful that, all right, she's disclosed to herself and she's disclosed to her friends. So that's good. Then about a month later, I get a phone call from Nicole, and she says, "Mom, you won't believe what my psychology teacher asked today." She said, "My psychology teacher asked, does anybody in this class know somebody with a disability?" And I raised my hand and I said, "I have ADHD and my mom has ADHD and she's a professor at the Ohio State University." And so this really underscored for me how students don't gain self-determination and self-advocacy by going through a curriculum or participating in one IEP meeting, or maybe all 4 IEP meetings of their high school curriculum, but it's a process that students go through, and we need to use the teachable moments that are presented to us as we teach English or math or science or history, or help a student prepare for their next IEP meeting. So at a conference that I attended, I met LaDerek Horn, and LaDerek and I both had a goal of wanting to write a book together, and realizing that for 10 years or more, we had been out in the field talking about self-determination, talking about self-advocacy, talking about the fact that a disability does not limit what you can achieve for the most part. And we decided to work together on developing a framework to support students with disabilities on understanding their path to disability pride, and just how we have the Black Lives Matter and oppression among the many different diverse groups. We wanted to create a disability pride framework for people with disabilities, especially as they age into middle and high school and transition to college. And so we actually wrote a book, Empowering Students with Hidden Disabilities, A Path to Pride and Success. However, these strategies are not limited to people with hidden disabilities, because people with visual impairments and more visible disabilities can also benefit from the path to disability pride. So the path for disability pride really is a cycle, but it's not necessarily linear. And so you have the path of disability shame on the right side of the screen, and then a path of disability pride on the left side of the screen. And there is a challenge that occurs. You're either having trouble with geometry or having trouble with reading or having trouble learning math concepts. You search for what the solution is. Maybe it's an issue with the type of teaching strategies that are used, or maybe it's a disability that's causing the challenge. And so we search for the right solution, and oftentimes we find that it actually is a disability, that our brains of people with disabilities are a little different, and we might need some special learning supports or some special accommodations. And how that information is presented to students can impact whether they cycle into the path of disability shame or cycle into the path of disability pride. And so that awareness is key. And families often need to be part of this process of understanding what a learning disability or what ADHD means, and understanding the same type of positive role models, that having a disability doesn't define you, that it doesn't compromise who they can become. So when you look at the path of disability shame, they don't accept they have a disability. They have disability shame. They reject any supports that may be offered to them. They engage in maladaptive behavior, and there is a risk of underachievement, of either not getting the GPA one needs to get into college, or not being able to get into the career technical program to learn the plumbing or carpentry or office skills you need, or health skills you need to enter a career of your choice. Or you can accept that you have a disability, accept that your brain learns differently, is wired a little differently, and disclose first to yourself and to your family that you learn differently, and that you're going to be using supports to be able to keep pace with our peers. And we are going to need to learn to self-advocate to gain the accommodations that we've learned in middle and high school work for us and help us keep pace with our career goals and our college goals. And we know that once you advocate, you can connect to the disability community and you can gain disability pride. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to become a spokesperson on disability awareness like Ladera Horn and have disability pride. I had a hairdresser who had a significant learning disability and was pulled out of school because they told her she was mentally retarded, and her family wasn't going to have her live with that label. And she's a very successful businesswoman who is a very high-end cosmetologist. And she refuses to share with people that she has a disability. And she only shared it with me because I told her I was writing this book. But she refused to be a case study in the book because she's like, I don't want anybody to know that I have a learning disability. And she just hires the accounting support that she needs to manage her books. And so I don't want to mean that every single student with a disability has to transition to disability pride, but it is much better to have at least the ability to advocate and have the self-awareness to disclose to yourself and others and use those supports that are out there for you to use. Just as with my daughter, Nicole, it's a process of gaining self-determination and self-advocacy skills. You don't just gain disability pride by having and completing one self-advocacy or self-determination curriculum. And what Laderick and I learned is that just because you're on the pride side of the cycle and framework, some days it doesn't mean that you're not gonna on other tasks be on the shame side. Laderick and I outlined our book and gave ourselves 9 months to write the book, and it actually took 2 years. And we had to get together on a Saturday morning and say, okay, I totally missed that deadline. And we would not spend more than a minute or two making excuses to ourselves and to each other about why we missed the deadline. But we'd focus on what our plan was to get back on track and to get that next chapter done and move it to that next level so we can send it to our editor and keep that book moving. And so what we learned through the process of setting a very high goal for ourselves was that it's okay to wake up some days and not have enough sleep, or not eat the right foods, or not have the right supports, or walk into school and have somebody look at us wrong and kind of fall on that shame side and feel kind of bad about our performance on a given task. But what you need to learn to do is pick yourself up and come up with an action plan to get you back on that success cycle. So assessing self-determination is critical, and I understand that you've had several transition assessment sessions during this conference, and I want to just point out that there are assessments out there, and just as you assess transition skills and independent living skills, there are many assessments, and I've highlighted 4 that you can use to assess self-determination. And so please go to your transition assessment expert to get more information about strategies to assess self-determination. And also, we need to assess and teach students to use the supports that are available for students with disabilities. Things like accommodations, extra time on tests. Oftentimes in middle school and high school, those accommodations are naturally built into our courses. You know, Nicole had this strategy where if she didn't finish her math test, she could just write on top, I need more time, and then her next free period, she could finish that math test. Well, when you get into college, you need to do more than just write on top of the test. You need more time, and knowing how to advocate for those accommodations are critical. Using technology. There's so many great universal technology apps out there that will help with time management and organization. It's fabulous. Medication gets a bum rap. Laderick says he used to really think that our entire society is over-medicated. And yet, when he met me, he said, wow, I finally met somebody who uses Adderall appropriately and says medication is the appropriate support that can help me operate more independently. And so medication has its place, and yes, we may be over medicating in some areas, but don't dismiss the value of medication as a support. Teachers, friends, and mentors. Make sure that you as your student's teacher know that you are there for support. And tutoring services and families. So let me tell you a little story about tutoring services. So Nicole, when she found out she was flunking geometry, you know, we had one of those meetings with the geometry teacher, the intervention specialist, and the parents. And Nicole sat there saying, I don't even understand what to write down. I am totally lost. And so the geometry teacher said, well, I'm available during your free period, or a math teacher is available during your free period who can help you with that assignment, and you just go to the library. And then the intervention specialist said, well, and we also have the National Honor Society providing free tutoring through the guidance office. So if you prefer, Nicole, you can go to the guidance office during your free period and sign up to have a National Honor Society student teach you. Well, Nicole said, and I don't want to talk to the teacher about what I understand, what I don't understand. I'd feel a lot more comfortable talking to the National Honor Society student about helping me complete my biology or my geometry assignments. And from sophomore year on throughout high school, one of the first things Nicole did was sign up for tutoring from the National Honor Society during her free period, and they would match her with a student who was really good at with whatever deficit Nicole was presenting with that year. And she took that skill to college and would put together a small group of students from a class that was going to have a test in 3 or 4 days and say, hey, would you like to get together tonight in my room, and we'll study together for the test, because she learned that she is an auditory social learner, and she learns better talking the content over with her friends than sitting down and studying in the library. And so that is what I mean when I say we have to help our students learn how they learn and how to put together the supports they need to be able to meet the challenges that school, high school, or college, or a job will present in the future. And so the self-determination transition model is another research-based strategy that Carrie Sjogren has written about, and just Google self-determined transition model and self-determined transition model of instruction. And you will find teacher's guides and learning resources and research articles that basically says, by involving students in setting their goal, they are more likely to achieve that goal. And so use this process of helping students set their goal, helping students develop their plan, and then helping students assess what they've learned and self-regulate their plan. And there is a lot of resources out there to help teachers implement the actual steps for the self-determined transition model of instruction. Then there's lots of commercial products out there that teach self-determination skills. The Next Step curriculum is a curriculum that I've worked with teachers in gen ed settings and special ed settings to teach self-determination skills and transition planning skills to all students, not just students with disabilities. In fact, if you look at the Next Step curricula, you won't find the word disability throughout the curricula, because it's really designed for all students, because all students need to plan their transition from high school to college and careers. And there's a wonderful assessment in the Next Step curriculum. Whose Future Is It Anyway is published by the Attainment Group, and that is also a curriculum that's out there. The Choosing Employment Goal was published by Sopris West, but now it's all been converted to free downloadable resources at the Zero site, zero.org, and you can again Google just Zero at the University of Oklahoma, and you will find many, many free resources to teach self-determination skills. My Future, My Plan is another resource that's available. So the Next Step curricula, since I spent 3 years piloting this in gen ed settings, I just want to share a little bit about the Next Step curricula. There is an assessment in the curricula where the student evaluates their own skills in terms of academic skills, independent living skills, ability to find a job, ability to manage their emotions, which are all key areas. And also their teacher assesses the student. And then you can have a coach, a family member, or a mentor that knows the student well complete a third assessment. And then the student can identify their strengths and identify areas that they need to improve. And then the students actually set goals to take charge of their own transition planning, and they assume responsibility for important life events and decisions with the support from teachers and parents. And it's a great curricula to use. But what I learned from the teachers who use this curricula is it's not automatic that students learn to set goals and set the right goal for a given time frame, that students need a lot of practice. And this very wise 8th grade English language arts teacher told me that I think we should have students set goals every week and then assess every week whether it was the right goal, whether they were able to implement their plan every single day of the week, whether their goal was too big or too little, or how to self-regulate their behavior every day to make sure they were on track to meet that goal by Friday. And she said it took students lots of practice, like more than a month of setting goals and then evaluating whether they reached those goals. And for some students, they had to develop daily goals. And in fact, she developed class goals where all students had to arrive with their books, with their pencil, with their homework done. And then if they did that 5 days in a row, she would give them all a free pass or let them all have a bubblegum chewing session for that whole Friday class. And what she observed were students supporting other students because there was this team approach and we wanted everybody to win the prize. And so they were checking with each other before class, like, do you have your pencil? Do you have your book? Do you have your homework done? And passing out pencils to make sure that they were able to. And that is a great scenario where students are supporting each other in meeting a group goal. So, and I wanted to speak a little bit about student-driven IEP. This is definitely an evidence-based self-determination practice. There are 11 steps to the student-driven IEP. And even if students can only accomplish the first 3 steps during a given IEP meeting, that's fabulous, because being able to walk into a meeting, introduce everybody at that meeting, introducing your parents to your teachers and the guidance counselor and the district rep and maybe the VR counselor who is logging on digitally from their office, then that is an important step that begins to build that self-confidence. Then we always recommend that students share one goal that they've met and describe what it means to meet that goal, and then present one goal that they have for that next year. And we've adapted this process with students with intellectual disabilities in a college program for students with ID. And we have students develop a PowerPoint that actually walks through the 11 steps of the student-driven IEP process. And the learning occurs in the preparation for the meeting, not as much as during the meeting. And so the more energy you can put into preparing students to actively participate in their IEP, the more you'll see growth in students' self-determination, self-efficacy, and ability to set goals and evaluate their goals. And then I want to share another evidence-based practice with you all. It's the Envision It curriculum, and it serves transition-age youth with and without disabilities. Again, you'll see that's a theme. I believe all students need these types of skills to learn to plan their own transition. It can be used by gen educators or special educators. It's customizable using a Schoology learning management system or Google Classroom. It's aligned with Common Core standards. It conducts a transition assessment and self-directed transition planning. So students actually take a number of transition assessments and then develops a PowerPoint that they can present to share what kind of learner they are and what their interests are and what their abilities are and what kind of accommodations they need. And it's all delivered digitally. And so in this COVID pandemic climate that we're in, students are learning to use information technology and improving their computer literacy. So all of this is built into the Envision It curriculum. It's aligned with IDEA Indicator 13, so students complete age-appropriate transition assessments and they write their own measurable post-secondary goals for employment and further education and training. It's aligned with the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, pre-employment transition skills of job exploration counseling, work-based learning, counseling on how to find the right college program to meet your needs, workplace readiness training, and self-advocacy skills. And so all of this is built into the Envision It curriculum. And it guides students in building a digital transition portfolio, including the age-appropriate transition assessments, and uses UDL. The transition portfolio includes the results of their transition assessment, so their career vision survey, the VARC, the ONET interest profile, based on this is just 3 of about 8 different assessments that are actually in the Envision It curriculum. And then students have to do a compare and contrast chart of 2 to 4 careers, depending on what the teacher thinks is most important. And compare those careers based on working conditions, salary, whether they need a license or an industry recognized credential or a degree, and then students can make a more informed choice. And then they actually write their measurable employment goals, and their portfolio includes that research chart that helps them explain to their IEP team why they believe that going into a trade is the best choice for them, or why going to college may be the best choice for them. They also have a post-secondary goal and a career plan for their first choice career and their second choice career. We try not to talk students out of putting down that they want to join the NBA or the NFL, but always have a backup plan. You know, if you don't make the high school football team, maybe that's an indication that maybe you might want to change your first career goal and go with your backup plan. And it also helps students align their course schedule, and they develop short-term goals, obviously resume, cover story, learning how to fill out job and college applications, learning the do's and don'ts about job interview skills, and then making that digital presentation either at their IEP meeting, or I've seen a lot of teachers use this as a capstone event where every student presents their transition portfolio, and it gives all the students an opportunity to really expand their understanding of careers and how a learning style and an interest inventory result and research combines to identify what that student thinks is the best career that given year. In Ohio, it's the Envision It curriculum has been integrated into English language arts classes, financial literacy classes, technology literacy classes, freshman seminar, business ed, career advising. I mean, it's been taught in so many different settings, and it's something that can be integrated with a curriculum that you are already teaching, or it can become the sole curriculum for a given course. Finally, I want to just share the importance of mentoring. We need to connect all students with and without disabilities, with and without hidden disabilities, to mentors so that they can gain that positive reinforcement. And it can be a real mentor where we can use high school students to mentor middle school students, or it can be a virtual mentor where they just learn about a person who has a disability that's similar to theirs or is of interest to them, and learn about that specific disability. There's a lot of ways that different schools have implemented mentoring. There are self-advocacy clubs. You can invite college students with disabilities to speak with students. You can bring high school students with IEPs to talk to elementary or middle school students. You can hire LaDerek to talk about mentoring. There is a organization called Eye to Eye that is a national organization that was started by David Flink, who has ADHD and a learning disability, and was actually kicked out of school because he had too many learning needs, that the private school that he was at in New York City said, we can't teach your son, so he needs to go to a different school. So that created in him such a passion for helping other students like himself that he developed the Eye to Eye program. And he has designed a number of activities where students will do an art project, and they build a superhero belt of all the skills they can use when they're feeling frustrated or shamed about having a disability. David Flink wrote a book called Thinking Differently, which we have found to be really helpful for to understand more of what David's motivation was to starting Eye to Eye, which is this multi-million-dollar organization run out of New York City. And I want to encourage teachers and district personnel to tell your story. Maybe you're not ready to disclose to your entire class if you have ADHD. But every time I disclose that I have ADHD, or I've been on antidepressants for 5 years, somebody in the audience of teachers that I speak to will come up to me and say, you know, I can identify because I have ADHD, and I've never thought about sharing that with a student. But tell your story, and maybe it doesn't have to be your story, but a story of another teacher or another person who had a disability similar to a young adult, to a student you have who is struggling with that label of having a disability. Connect to the disability community. And, you know, in this age of inclusion, which I am all for inclusion, there also needs to be a time for students with disabilities to connect to others. And whether your state has a leadership forum or a self-advocacy club or college mentors who start an eye-to-eye program at your high school, it can really open up the eyes and the futures for people with disabilities who are afraid to disclose even to themselves. Use positive role models that are in the media. For example, Daniel Radcliffe, star of Harry Potter, has dyspraxia. In our book on page 27, we've outlined famous people with disabilities, from Albert Einstein to Bill Gates and Temple Grandin and Whoopi Goldberg and Tom Cruise and Tom Tebow. Take a look at what's going to turn your students on. Is it sports? Then you might want to match them up with Tom. Is it action films? Then maybe it's Tom Cruise. Is it autism? Temple Grandin has written so many wonderful books that people with autism can really identify with. And people without autism, I think everybody needs to learn to value the struggle that Temple went through as an elementary student and as a high school student. She said, if they made me pass algebra before I could do geometry, I never would have graduated from high school. But geometry really made sense to her autistic brain, whereas algebra didn't. And so thank heavens she was in a school system that offered that type of flexibility, where they let her take geometry first, and people began to recognize what a genius she was when it came to geometric principles. Have your students watch Shark Tank. Kevin O'Leary and Damon John are both very outspoken about their learning disabilities. And in fact, more than 35% of America's entrepreneurs are people with learning disabilities. And so there's a place for us. We might not fit the mold, but if you watch Shark Tank, you will see that these multimillionaires are really bright and have nothing to be embarrassed about because they had a learning disability and maybe struggled at some point in their educational system. You may have noticed that Michael Phelps has been on TV indicating how helpful counseling has been for him. He won more gold medals than any other swimmer at the time he was an Olympic champion. And he has revealed that he does have ADHD, and he has dealt with depression. And he talks about how much counseling has helped him. And just like counseling was very helpful for my daughter when she was in the throes of high school and peer pressure and not being able to keep up in geometry classes and biology classes and needing to seek out tutoring every single free period she had. Counseling can be very helpful. And I know that our counseling staff in schools are overburdened, but I think that it's very, very helpful for school systems to contract with outside counselors, or at least encourage families to gain counseling if certain students would really benefit from counseling. There are a number of celebrities that have become very outspoken about mental health issues that they've struggled with, such as anxiety and depression. And any one of these stars, you can read about their personal journey of accepting the fact that they had depression or they had anxiety. And when you think about the fact that these stars are being filmed or performing in front of folks, they needed to overcome that anxiety and depression to be able to go in front of that camera or go live in front of that audience. And, we know that Harry and these stars have also disclosed dealing with mental health issues. And so there's no shortage of positive role models out there that can help normalize the feelings of despair, the feelings of anxiety and depression that many of our students may encounter, whether it be just for a day or whether it be for an entire semester or an entire year. And so all of these folks have come out to say, get the help you need. It's okay. We live in a complicated world. We're educating people in a complicated school system. And with the COVID pandemic, it just makes things even more challenging. And so we need to be able to accept the fact that maybe we need to get some help. We can help students get to a point where they use their disability as a positive identifier and develop the self-determination and self-advocacy skills that they need to plan their transition to college and careers and achieve their transition to college and careers. I've really enjoyed being with all of you for this hour, and I really believe that it is the mission of all of our schools to help understand disability as part of our communities, and that should be part of all of our schools' mission to really normalize disability so that it becomes no big deal that Jimmy or Jonah or Judah has a learning disability or has Down syndrome or uses a wheelchair. And that's my hope for all of you, is that you work each day to normalize disability within your school communities. Thank you very much.
For more resources, be sure to visit the Transition Alliance of South Carolina's webpage at transitionalliancesc.org. Thank you and have a great day.